Clyde Waverley had nearly 15 years of experience as a forest ranger in the northern forests of Idaho, a majestic and peaceful land with towering trees, winding rivers, and trails leading deep into the wilderness. His job, though not overly dangerous, had given him the chance to witness the strange and mysterious aspects of nature. However, one day in 1998, Clyde encountered something he would never forget. This event turned an ordinary workday into a haunting memory that would stay with him for the rest of his life. That morning, the sky was clear, and soft sunlight filtered through the treetops, creating a rare, peaceful scene. Clyde had been tasked with inspecting lesser-used trails to ensure they hadn't been damaged by the recent heavy rains. Carrying his backpack and rifle, a necessary tool for self-defense against wildlife, he began his patrol at dawn. With the familiar sounds of birds and rustling leaves, Clyde felt the usual calmness of the forest. But around midday, as he stopped to rest by a small stream, something began to feel off. The birds suddenly fell silent. A stillness blanketed the forest, making Clyde uneasy. For someone who spent so much time in the wilderness, this silence was anything but normal. He listened carefully but heard nothing except faint, distant sounds. Clyde continued his work. But a sense of unease followed him. By early afternoon, Clyde ventured into a part of the forest that few people visited, a place not marked on any official maps. This area was known only through word of mouth among the rangers. There was an old trail here, long abandoned and overgrown after years of neglect. Clyde decided to explore it, wondering if the recent storms had caused any damage. After walking deeper into the woods, he came across a strange sight. A small, deserted campsite hidden in the forest. Everything at the campsite seemed long forgotten. A weathered and torn tent stood next to a cold, ashy fire pit. Clyde called out, hoping to find someone, but the only response was his own voice echoing in the eerie silence. A chill ran down his spine as he searched the camp. The old, rusted tin cans and other items offered no clues about who might have stayed there. Just as he was about to leave, Clyde noticed something unusual. Carved into a nearby tree was a symbol, a large circle with an X through it. Clyde had never seen such a symbol before, and made a mental note to mention it to his colleagues when he returned. As he began his journey back, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. The forest remained oppressively quiet. Clyde felt as though something was watching him. He quickened his pace, gripping his rifle tightly, alert to even the smallest sound. As dusk started to settle, Clyde still couldn't shake the feeling. The fading light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long, ominous shadows everywhere. Suddenly, from a bush to the left, a rustling sound broke the silence. Clyde froze, his heart racing as he pointed his gun towards the source of the noise. "Is anyone there?" Clyde called out, his voice tinged with a hint of anxiety. No reply came. Cautiously moved toward the bush, rifle ready to fire. But as he got closer, everything fell silent again. Just as Clyde was about to breathe a sigh of relief, something suddenly leaped out of the bushes toward him. He fell backward, dropping his rifle, frantically looking around but seeing nothing. Clyde's heart pounded as if it were about to burst from his chest, his hands trembling as he struggled to get back on his feet. Grabbing his rifle, he quickly fled, glancing back over his shoulder every few steps. Nothing followed him, but fear had already taken over his mind. He continued to run towards the ranger station, barely making it back as darkness fully engulfed the forest. At the station, Marta, fellow ranger, immediately noticed Clyde's pale face and shaking hands. "Clyde, what happened?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. Clyde tried to catch his breath, but the fear still overwhelmed him. I don't know," Clyde replied, his voice still unsteady. "Something's not right out there." Clyde recounted the entire event to Marta, from the abandoned campsite to the feeling of being watched and the sudden attack. Marta frowned, but she didn't dismiss the strangeness of it all. They decided to report the incident and investigate further the next day. That night, Clyde couldn't sleep. Every moment in the forest haunted him, the strange sounds, the eerie feeling of being watched, and the unexpected attack left him unable to calm down. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the deep darkness of the woods and felt as though something was still out there, waiting for him. The next morning, Clyde and Marta prepared thoroughly for their return to the forest. They set out at dawn, hoping to uncover more concrete clues about the strange occurrences from the previous day. They chose a different route to cover more ground, both of them remaining highly alert. Clyde couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, while Marta trusted his instincts after so many years working together. When they returned to the campsite Clyde had discovered the day before, everything was just as it had been, still and shrouded in mystery. Marta examined the strange symbol on the tree while Clyde scouted the surrounding area. Suddenly, he noticed a faint trail on the ground, like a small path leading deeper into the forest. It was only a slight scratch in the grass and dry leaves, but enough to catch Clyde's attention. Called Marta over, and the two decided to follow the trail. They moved slowly, cautiously, so as not to lose faint trail. The forest grew darker and more silent with every step. The sounds of birds and rustling wind had completely vanished, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Clyde's sense of unease grew stronger, but he knew they had to keep going. After about an hour of walking, they came across something that made Clyde's blood run cold. A different campsite, but this time it was entirely different. The scene before them looked like something out of a nightmare. The tent was torn to shreds, blood stains were splattered across the ground, and the signs of a fierce struggle were evident. The ashes from the campfire were still smoldering, as if the horrific event had just occurred shortly before their arrival. Marta slowly stepped back, her eyes wide with horror, but Clyde tried to stay composed, though he felt equally shaken inside. "We need to check this area," he said, his voice trembling. There was a firmness in his words. They began searching the surroundings, and it wasn't long before they made the most horrific discovery. First body. It was a man, his clothes torn to pieces, and his body ravaged by something ferocious. His face was distorted in terror, his eyes wide open, staring blankly as if he had witnessed something beyond human comprehension. Marta knelt down to check his pulse, but it was clear he had been dead for some time. They continued to move and found two more bodies nearby, all in the same state. A wave of nausea washed over Clyde as he looked at the gruesome scene before him. "We need to report this immediately," Marta whispered, her eyes fixed on the savagely slain bodies. They quickly set up a temporary perimeter around the site and reported the incident to the authorities. While waiting for assistance, Clyde couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from deep within the forest. It wasn't just a trick of the mind. Although he scanned the trees and bushes with his eyes, nothing concrete revealed itself. But an invisible fear weighed on him, keeping him in a state of constant readiness to fire. When the police arrived, they immediately took control of the scene and began their investigation. But what troubled Clyde the most was this. There were no clear signs of the attacker. No footprints, no specific clues to explain the origin of the massacre. Only blood and terror. In the days that followed, the forest seemed to return to normal. Birds chirped and the leaves rustled in the wind. However, Clyde couldn't shake the unease that lingered. He and Marta continued their patrols, but they decided not to venture into remote areas anymore. One evening, as Clyde was finishing his final patrol of the day, he heard it again. The sound of footsteps. Gentle, but this time unmistakable. Clyde turned around, his heart suddenly tightening, as he spotted a vague figure among the trees. It was a tall creature, with long legs and eyes that lacked any discernible features, but Clyde could feel the danger radiating from it. The creature stood still, staring at Clyde for a few seconds, then disappeared into the shadows. Clyde stood frozen, unable to speak. He knew that whatever that creature was, it was still out there, lurking, watching. And Clyde realized one thing with absolute clarity. Forest was no longer the peaceful place he once thought it was. The memory of that creature would haunt him for the rest of his life, and no matter how hard he tried, couldn't forget those soulless eyes. From that day on, no one ever saw any trace of the creature again. Clyde knew it was always present, just waiting for the next opportunity. I am Bo Donahue, a ranger working in the Allegheny National Forest, Pennsylvania. In 1998, I experienced an event that I will never forget for the rest of my life. At the time, I had been working there for about 5 years. My job was quite peaceful, mostly involving patrolling the trails, assisting hikers, and ensuring that wildlife didn't get too close to people. The Allegheny forest in the fall is a stunning landscape, with the red and orange hues of the leaves turning each workday into a living nature painting. That morning started like any other. I had just returned from a 3-day break and was getting back to work. I remember driving the old agency pickup truck, a worn-out Chevy with more miles than I could count, along a trail. That's when I saw a woman standing by the roadside, waving for help. Her appearance wasn't too unusual, as many hikers often get lost in the woods and need our assistance. I stopped the truck and asked, "Hello, is something wrong?" She looked worried, speaking with a voice full of tension. "My friend, he left the trail to take some photos. It's been too long, and he hasn't come back." I radioed the center to inform them that I was assisting a lost hiker, then invited her into the truck. While driving, I asked for the name of the missing friend. "Don Martin," she replied. I could sense the fear in her voice, which made me a little uneasy, though these temporary missing cases weren't uncommon. We drove to the last spot where Don had been seen. The forest here was dense, with thick underbrush and towering trees that blocked out the sky. I began the search, carrying a flashlight and a first aid kit, while the girl, whose name was Lydia, walked alongside me. Throughout the trek, we called Don's name, but only an eerie silence answered us. The air grew heavier, and Lydia's anxiety became more palpable with each passing moment. We had been searching for about half an hour when we suddenly stumbled upon a small clearing. That's when things started to get strange. I looked around and noticed signs of a struggle, broken branches and disturbed ground. However, there were no clear signs of Don. I knelt down for a closer look and saw strange footprints on the ground. These footprints were far too large and distorted, unlike any human tracks I had ever seen before. Back at the ranger station, I reported Don's death, but I didn't dare mention the creature we had faced. Who would believe me? Don was deemed a victim of a bear attack, and Lydia and I were given time off to recover. I knew the truth. I had seen the wendigo. It wasn't just a legend, it was real. And it was still out there, lurking in the dark corners of the Allegheny forest. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the image of the wendigo from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those empty sockets, the gaping mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth and the deep, guttural growl that echoed from the depths of its throat. The Allegheny forest was no longer the peaceful place it once was. Every rustling leaf, every small noise made me jump, fearing that the creature would reappear at any moment. Lydia wasn't doing any better. She lived in constant fear. Eyes were vacant, face pale, and her hands often trembled whenever the events of that day were mentioned. We were both haunted by the creature that had killed Don and attacked us. Yet neither of us had the courage to tell the full truth, the police or our colleagues. Our story would be dismissed as madness, and we would be labeled as lunatics. One early morning, after returning from a brief leave, I sat in the office, flipping through the report on Don's case. Everything was documented as a bear attack. But I knew that wasn't the truth. The wendigo was responsible, and I couldn't allow it to keep hunting innocent people in the forest. Determined to uncover the truth, I returned to the scene of the incident, better prepared this time. Armed with a flashlight, a rifle, and a sharp knife, I decided to venture alone into the deep forest where the creature had attacked us. I knew the danger that awaited me, but I couldn't live in fear forever. The trail that Lydia and I had walked was now covered in decaying leaves and broken branches. It felt as though the forest itself was breathing, as if everything around me was alive and watching my every step. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, but I didn't stop. I knew what I had to do. When I reached the clearing where Don had been attacked, I paused to take a deep breath. There were no remnants of the horrific battle from that day, but I knew the wendigo was still somewhere nearby. I stood in silence, feeling the wind brush past, waiting. Suddenly, from a hidden corner of the forest, I heard a rustling sound. My heart began to race, and I grabbed my rifle, ready to fire. The sound grew louder with each passing second, as if something was approaching me. Cold sweat ran down my spine, and I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or the creature I was seeking. Then, as if from a nightmare, the wendigo appeared. Stood right before me. tall and gaunt with pale skin. Its long, sharp claws gleamed under the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Its eyes, two deep, empty sockets, seemed to peer into my soul, making every movement of mine feel sluggish. A low growl emanated from its throat, deep and menacing, like a call from the depths of hell. There was no time to think. I pulled the trigger, and the gunshot echoed through the forest. The bullet flew straight at the creature, but it dodged effortlessly, as if nothing had happened. The wendigo charged at me with terrifying speed, and in that moment, I knew that bullets wouldn't stop it. I stepped back, trying to keep distance between myself and the creature, but it was too fast. The wendigo slammed into me, sending me flying backward. The impact was so powerful that I felt as if my bones were about to shatter. I rolled across the ground, clutching my rifle tightly, but I knew that I couldn't fight it this way. In my panic, I remembered the old legend about the wendigo from native folklore. The wendigo couldn't be killed by conventional weapons. There was only one way to defeat it: fire. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to reach the fire pit I had prepared earlier. The wendigo roared and chased after me, closing the distance quickly. I lit a match and tossed it onto the pile of logs that had already been soaked with oil. The fire roared to life, casting bright light across the surrounding area. The wendigo recoiled as the flames spread, as if fire was the only thing it feared. I didn't stop, continuing to hurl burning logs toward it. The creature howled in agony, its skin starting to burn and shrink, as if it didn't belong to this world. Finally, the wendigo retreated into the darkness of the forest, leaving behind the stench of charred flesh in the air. I collapsed beside the dwindling fire, trembling all over, cold sweat running down my face. My breaths were ragged, and my heart pounded as if it would burst out of my chest. It was the first time in my life I truly felt I had faced death, and it was hard to believe I was still alive after the terrifying encounter with the wendigo. I struggled to steady my breathing, my hands shaking as I reached for the radio in my backpack to report the incident. But then I stopped, my mind swirling with questions. Who would believe me? Who would believe that a mythical creature appeared in the Allegheny forest? Would they think I was insane, or that I had lost my mind? The fire crackled in the night, and I sat there, my thoughts spinning aimlessly. I stared into the darkness, listening to the wind howling through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, just waiting for the right moment to return. Though I had driven it away, the wendigo wasn't easily destroyed, and I wasn't sure that the next encounter would end the same way. Everything around me suddenly became eerily quiet. Forest, once my home, place I loved and had spent most of my life protecting, was now filled only with haunting fear. I no longer recognized it. Every leaf, every branch seemed to conceal something dark and sinister, keeping me on edge. I couldn't stay still for long. With a strength that came from somewhere deep within, I stood up, put out the fire, and started gathering my things. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The wendigo had vanished, but I wasn't foolish enough to think it wouldn't return. And worse, I knew it wouldn't stop with Dawn or Lydia. It would continue to hunt anyone unfortunate enough to wander into this forest. My name is Wes Arnett, ranger at Big Bend National Park in Texas. This park is famous for its towering rocky mountains and rugged trails that stretch across the scorching desert. I've worked here for over 10 years, and nothing could ever make me fear this place. Until that night. The night I will never forget. It was summer, and Big Bend was like a furnace, with temperatures soaring above 40 degrees Celsius during the day. At night, the temperature would drop suddenly, creating a stark contrast between day and night. Wild creatures like wolves, snakes, and mountain lions were most active at night, and my job was to patrol the area to ensure no incidents occurred. That night, I was driving my off-road vehicle down the dusty trails. The moon hung low in the sky, casting faint light over the desolate landscape ahead. Everything was peaceful, with only the sound of the engine and the crunch of the tires on the dry ground breaking the silence of the night. I planned to finish my patrol route before heading back to the station to rest. However, as I ventured deeper into the area near the Mexican border, a seldom visited region, I began to feel that something wasn't right. Atmosphere changed. It became heavy, oppressive, as though some strange presence had invaded my mind. The usual desert sounds, the wind whistling through the canyons, the soft whisper of the sand, seemed to disappear, giving way to an unsettling silence. I decided to stop the vehicle and check things out. The headlights cut through the pitch-black darkness in front of me, casting long, eerie shadows across the sandy ground. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, feeling the cold night air wrap around me. My boots crunched on the cracked, dry earth as I walked toward a small path that led into the darkness. After walking a few dozen meters, a sudden sound echoed from the distance, making me jump. It was a growl, but unlike any animal I had ever heard before, it was deep, low, and didn't seem to belong to this world. My hand instinctively grabbed my gun, my eyes darting in the direction of the sound, trying to make out something in the thick darkness. The beam of my flashlight caught something moving. At first I thought it was a wolf or perhaps a mountain lion, creatures familiar to Big Bend, but as I got closer, my heart nearly stopped. This thing was unlike any animal I had ever seen. It stood on two hind legs, taller than a grown man, with taut, wrinkled gray skin. Its eyes, two glowing red dots like fire, pierced through the darkness, staring directly at me. In that moment, I couldn't move. My entire body was paralyzed by terror. This wasn't a wild animal. It was too large, too strange. Its long, sharp claws scratched the ground, leaving deep marks in the sand. Its wide mouth, filled with knife-like teeth, curled into a threatening snarl, accompanied by a deep growl. I tried to keep calm, but fear consumed my mind. Slowly, I stepped backward, gripping my rifle tightly, ready to fire if it came any closer. But it didn't attack right away. It just stood there, its fiery eyes locked on me, as if sizing up its prey before making a move. I took another cautious step back, but a branch snapped underfoot, throwing me off balance. In that split second, the creature lunged at me with terrifying speed, faster than any animal I'd ever encountered. I barely had time to react. My finger pulled the trigger, the shot rang out, but the creature dodged it effortlessly. Lunged toward me, claws raised, ready to tear me apart. I rolled to the side, barely avoiding its attack. The sound of its claws scraping the ground sent chills down my spine. My face hit the rough sand hard, burning with pain, but I had no time to care. The creature had turned, preparing to strike again. I scrambled to my feet, quickly pulling the knife from my belt, knowing that if I didn't act now, I wouldn't survive. The creature charged, and I lunged toward it, thrusting the knife into its weak spot. The blade sank deep into the thin skin under its chin, but instead of blood, thick, black, viscous liquid oozed out. The creature roared, a sound so deep I could feel the air vibrating. It shoved me hard, knocking me to the ground, but this time, it quickly rolled out of its reach. In an instant, I knew I had to run. I couldn't keep fighting this thing. It was too fast, too strong. I sprinted toward my truck, legs trembling but pushing with all my strength. The creature chased after me, and I could hear its horrific gasping breath, feel the danger right behind me. Every sense in my body was on edge, fighting for survival against the overwhelming fear. As I neared the truck, I flung myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, gasping for breath. The creature slammed its claws against the door, leaving terrifying dents. I quickly started the engine and floored the gas pedal. The tires spun, gripping the sand, and the truck shot forward. The creature still chased after me, but I managed to leave it behind, feeling a temporary sense of safety as I drove out of the danger zone. In the rearview mirror, I could see the silhouette of the creature standing there, silent in the darkness, its glowing red eyes following me until the night fully swallowed it. Back at the ranger station, I sat slumped in an old chair in the break room, my mind blank and my body still trembling from what had just happened. I tried to steady my breathing to calm down, but the image of that terrifying creature haunted me relentlessly. Those fiery red eyes filled with death, the long claws, and its lightning-fast movements. It was all like an unforgettable nightmare. The desert night sounds still echoed outside, but now they no longer brought the comfort they once did. Every sound became a warning of the lurking danger hidden in the shadows. That creature was still out there, waiting, hunting for more victims in the harsh desert. I told my coworkers about the incident, but as expected, none of them believed me. They looked at me with skeptical eyes, nodding sympathetically, but deep down, they all thought I was too exhausted and hallucinating. Every word I said was treated like fiction, product of imagination, after many years working under tough conditions. "You probably just saw a big mountain lion," one of my colleagues said, half joking. "Maybe you were just too tired and started seeing things." I didn't respond. I quietly stood up and left the room. I knew there was nothing I could do to convince them. The truth was too terrifying to believe, and I didn't blame them for not understanding what I had gone through. But I knew what I saw, and the feeling that no one believed me only deepened the fear inside me. The next day, I decided to return to the scene. I knew it sounded crazy, but part of me couldn't accept that the creature was still out there, unchecked. I needed to know more about what I had faced, even though I knew this return trip might not end well. Fully equipped with a flashlight, rifle, knife, and survival kit, I drove back to the area near the Mexican border, where I had encountered the creature. It was still early, the blazing desert sun casting down on the dusty trail, but my mood didn't lighten. My heart remained heavy with the fear from the previous night's encounter. When I arrived, I parked the truck and began searching for any trace of the creature. With cautious steps, I ventured deeper into the area where the creature had attacked me. Everything seemed untouched, but an eerie stillness hung over the landscape. There were no birds, no wind, just absolute silence, as if nature itself was hiding something. I crouched down and immediately recognized the long, deep claw marks on the ground. Marks left by the creature. The grooves were large and deep, as if its claws had dug into the sandy earth with unimaginable strength. My hands trembled as I touched those tracks. This was the proof I needed, but at the same time, a surge of fear welled up inside me. This creature wasn't an ordinary animal. It was stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than anything I had ever encountered. I could sense its presence, even though I couldn't see it. Felt as if the creature was somewhere nearby, waiting for a single moment of carelessness to strike again. A light breeze swept across the desert, but instead of offering relief, it carried with it an unsettling sense of dread. I turned, intending to head back to the truck, but just then, a deep sound echoed from behind me. That familiar growl, the sound of terror I could never forget. I spun around, and this time the creature stood clearly before me. It was over 2 meters tall, with gray, leathery skin and eyes that burned red like fire. Claws scraped the ground, producing a chilling screech. But this time I didn't feel the same fear as before. Instead, a part of me had prepared for it. The creature stared at me, and for a moment, a deadly silence hung between us. It didn't attack immediately. It seemed to be sizing me up, as if it knew I had returned to confront it. I gripped my rifle tightly, but I knew it wouldn't help. This creature couldn't be brought down by ordinary bullets. I needed to come up with something else, but at that moment, every idea in my mind seemed distant and unclear. The creature roared, and before I could react, it charged at me, faster than before. Everything seemed to slow down in that instant. I fired my gun, but as I had predicted, the bullet merely grazed its thick skin, causing no real harm. I knew I had to run, but this time I wasn't just fleeing. I was trying to survive, searching for a way to defeat this creature before it could take me down. I didn't know how I would do it, but I wasn't going to give up. My name is Lance Brigham, a ranger working in Minnesota's National Forest. For years, I've patrolled countless miles of trails through this dense wilderness, from the warm summer days to the freezing winters. To me, this forest was a wild, beautiful, and dangerous place, but never a frightening one. Until that fateful night. It was early autumn, when the leaves turned red and gold, and the forest seemed to don a radiant cloak. My colleague Rick and I were assigned to patrol a remote area deep in the forest, near the Canadian border. There had been rumors about a few hikers going missing in the area, but no one really knew what had happened. Some speculated they might have gotten lost or even been attacked by wild animals. But deep inside, I had an inexplicable feeling of unease. We set out early in the morning, walking along trails covered in dry leaves, the air crisp and cold. Rick was a good friend and a reliable colleague. He had worked in this forest longer than I had, and knew every corner of it like the back of his hand. We chatted casually as we walked, but I noticed Rick seemed more anxious than usual. "Do you believe in the rumors about this area?" I asked as we stopped to rest near a small stream. Rick sighed, his gaze drifting off into the dense woods. I'm not sure, Lance, but I've heard the stories, and some things I've seen can't be explained. I fell silent, staring at Rick. What did you see? Rick just shook his head, saying nothing more. His silence made me feel more uneasy than ever. We continued deeper into the forest, but this time, neither of us spoke. The atmosphere felt heavier, and the usual sounds of the forest, bird song, the wind rustling through the branches, seemed to vanish entirely. All that remained was the sound of our footsteps on the ground, and the oppressive silence blanketed the woods. After a few hours, we arrived at a small clearing deep in the forest. It was the last place where the missing hikers had been reported. Clearing was covered in a thick layer of leaves, with no sign of human presence. Yet something about it felt wrong. There were no birds, no wildlife, just absolute silence. Rick and I split up to search, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that clung to my mind. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I came across a bizarre sight. Tree trunks clawed and slashed, with long, deep gouges, as if something powerful and savage had attacked them. I bent down to examine them, and the marks didn't resemble anything I had ever seen before. They were too large, too strange. Rick, come take a look at this, I called out, my voice trembling slightly. Rick approached, staring intently at the claw marks on the trees. His expression grew serious, and I could see the tension etched across his face. What the hell happened here? I asked, the sense of unease growing stronger. Rick didn't answer immediately, continuing to study the marks with a disturbing silence. After a moment, he shook his head slightly. I don't know, but we need to leave. Now. Just as Rick finished speaking, an odd sound echoed from deep within the forest. It was a rustling noise, as if something was moving swiftly through the trees. Rick and I turned our heads toward the sound, and in that instant, felt as if time itself had frozen. A figure emerged from the misty depths of the forest. But it wasn't a wild animal. The creature stood on two legs taller than any grown man, with pale, ghostly skin and hollow, glowing eyes. Its head twisted unnaturally as if it were trying to pinpoint our location. Those empty eyes locked onto us, and I felt a chill run my spine. Lance, run! Rick shouted, but my feet felt like they were nailed to the ground. The creature charged at us with terrifying speed. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen. Not human, not animal. Its body was twisted and deformed, with long, sharp claws that scraped the ground, creating a chilling screech. Rick grabbed my hand and yanked me hard, snapping me out of my stupor. We both started running as fast as we could through the forest, but the creature was much faster. I could hear its growls behind us as if it was just meters away. We sprinted through the trees, desperately trying to maintain some distance. But the creature was closing in. My heart pounded in my chest. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare stop. When I glanced back, I saw it, closer than ever. Its sharp claws gleamed in the dim light, and I knew that if it caught us, we wouldn't survive. We reached a small cliff with no way out. Rick dove straight down, and I followed, both of us tumbling down the slope, our bodies slamming into rocks and branches. I heard the creature's roar from the top. It didn't pursue us further. We lay still, gasping for breath and racked with pain, but alive. I looked over at Rick, his face contorted with pain, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes. We can't go back. Dad, that thing is still out there, and it won't stop until it catches us. I nodded, knowing we had just barely escaped death, but the creature was still somewhere in the forest, waiting for its next chance to hunt us down. We would have to fight. But did we have enough time to figure out how to deal with this terrifying creature? We lay there, exhausted from the fall, our bodies aching but still breathing. The wind rustled through the trees above, but it no longer carried the peaceful feeling it once did. I glanced at Rick and saw fear in his eyes like I'd never seen before. This creature wasn't just a normal predator. It was something far worse, a mystery we couldn't comprehend. Rick struggled to sit up, his body trembling from the impact. We need to get out of here, now, he said, his voice firm but shaky. That thing, it's not something we can handle with a few ordinary weapons. I knew Rick was right. The creature had proven it wasn't of this world, didn't belong to the wilds we'd grown so familiar with over the years. The only thing we could do now was escape and warn others about the danger lurking in the forest. I forced myself to stand, my legs still aching from the fall, but fear pushed me forward. We began moving quickly through the forest, trying to retrace our steps. However, the forest now felt like a dark labyrinth, trails obscured by trees and thick underbrush. A sense of being lost and uneasy clung to me as we ventured deeper into the woods. We didn't speak a word the entire way. Both of us knew that time wasn't on our side. That creature could be trailing us, waiting for a moment of weakness. And we both understood that one small mistake would leave us with no way out. After a frantic run, we finally reached a small clearing where weak sunlight filtered through the thick canopy. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but at least we had a bit of light and a temporary place to rest. "I'm not sure we can escape it this way," Rick said, his voice filled with despair. He sat down, leaning against a large rock, his face showing clear signs of exhaustion and worry. I sat down next to him, unsure of what to say to reassure him. I didn't have any answers about what we would do next. Whatever that creature wanted, it was clear it wasn't just hunting us as prey. It had been following us, waiting, relishing in the fear it had inflicted. "I've heard stories about this thing before," Rick said after a long pause. "The older rangers, the ones who've worked these woods for decades, they call it the ghost of the forest." He stopped, his gaze distant. "No one has ever really seen it. It's just rumors, but they all say that anyone who sees this creature never comes back." A chill ran down my spine as Rick's words sank in. "So, the missing people?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Rick nodded. "Maybe it's the creature. This thing doesn't hunt for survival like other animals. It hunts for some reason we can't understand, and those who encounter it vanish without a trace." Despair washed over me, but at the same time, part of me refused to accept it. "We can't let it win," I said, trying to remain calm. "We know it's here. We know it's not just a myth or some rumor, and that means it can be beaten." Rick looked at me, a flicker of hope in his eyes, though it was still laced with doubt. "How do you plan on doing that?" "We have guns and knives, and it has." He didn't need to finish. We both knew that our weapons wouldn't be enough to stop the creature. I glanced around the small clearing, searching for anything that could help us survive. The trees cast long, dark shadows over most of the area, but in the distance, I noticed something that gave me a glimmer of hope. A more open space where the trees were sparse, leading out of the forest. "We need to lure it out of here," I said as an idea formed in my mind. "If we can lead it to an open area, where it can't hide in the shadows, maybe we'll have a chance." Rick looked at me, and his expression shifted from despair to determination. "Right, let's try it." We stood up, preparing for the bold plan. Both of us knew this might be our last chance. Creature was still out there, waiting, but this time we wouldn't be running anymore. We would face it head on. We started making our way back toward the path that led out of the deep forest. Could feel the creature's presence getting closer. The rustling in the trees wasn't an illusion anymore. It was behind us, silently following, waiting for the right moment to strike. My heart pounded, but this time it wasn't from fear. This time I knew we had a shot. We had a plan, and if we were lucky, this creature wouldn't have another chance to hunt anyone else. We approached the area where the trees began to thin. Sunlight started breaking through the canopy, casting faint beams of light, just enough to illuminate the path ahead. And just as we were about to reach the clearing, a guttural roar erupted from behind us. The creature had decided to attack. Rick and I turned around, and for a brief moment I saw it. Larger, more terrifying than ever, charging at us with blinding speed. Its claws flashed in the dim light, and its glowing red eyes burned like torches from the depths of hell. The creature barreled toward us at a speed I couldn't have imagined. Each of its movements seemed to tear through the air, and before I had time to brace myself, was only meters away. Rick shouted, but it wasn't out of fear. It was a final reminder before the life-or-death battle began. We had no way out. I raised my gun and fired instinctively, knowing it was the only thing I could do to buy us time. The shot rang out, splitting the eerie silence of the forest. The bullet flew toward the creature, but just like before, it merely grazed its thick hide, barely causing any harm. The creature roared, a sound that screeched through the air like the howl of a being from the underworld, enough to paralyze anyone in its path. Rick grabbed a large branch nearby and swung it at the creature as it lunged forward. The blow was strong enough to make the creature stagger for a moment. It quickly recovered, leaping with terrifying speed. There was no time to think anymore. Our only option was to keep running. Rick and I dashed toward the open area we had spotted earlier, hoping the creature would be slowed or at least hindered. As we reached the clearing, the creature had regained its footing and was closing in fast. I could hear the wind whistling as it tore through the trees, and its glowing red eyes never left us. My heart pounded faster than ever, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was the rush of adrenaline, primal instinct to survive. "This is it," Rick shouted, his eyes gleaming with final determination. He pointed toward the clearing just ahead, where the sunlight poured in strongly, creating a broad, bright area with no shadows for the creature to hide in. Rick and I burst into the clearing, panting and drenched in sweat. The creature halted at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing intensely but hesitating to approach. The sunlight seemed to be what it feared, the one thing that could keep it at bay in the darkness. Rick looked at me, his breath ragged but his voice resolute. "We need to lure it out here, under this light. It can't fight if it's exposed like this." I nodded, gripping my gun tightly. The creature roared again, clearly enraged by its inability to reach us. It circled the edge of the clearing, its eyes filled with hatred as it stared us down, but it didn't dare step into the light. We stood there, both of us breathing heavily, but not letting our guard down. This creature clearly wasn't one to give up easily. It would wait, looking for an opportunity to strike when the light dimmed or when we let our guard down. But we couldn't stay here forever. The sun would set, and when it did, the darkness would return, bringing with it the terror we couldn't face again. In that moment, I realized something. This creature wasn't immortal, and it had a weakness, light. It couldn't survive when exposed outside the dark corners of the forest. But how could we use that to our advantage? We didn't have weapons strong enough to kill it, and time was running out. Rick looked around, then smiled with determination. "Do you have a lighter?" he asked, voice no longer trembling. I nodded, pulling the lighter from my jacket pocket. "We'll use fire," Rick said, his eyes shining with the hope of survival. "If light can make it hesitate, then fire can drive it back." I immediately understood Rick's plan. The creature might be strong and fast, but it feared light, and perhaps fire was the only thing that could force it to retreat entirely. With no other choice, we began gathering dry branches and dead leaves from the surroundings, preparing for the final confrontation. I lit the fire, and the small flame quickly flickered to life, burning brightly in the cold, dense forest air. We threw the dry branches into the fire, causing it to grow stronger. The creature stood at the edge of the forest, roaring in anger as it saw the flames blaze before it. I could clearly see the rage and fear in its glowing red eyes. It stepped back but didn't leave the area. Rick grabbed a burning branch, holding it high in front of him as he moved toward the creature. "If you want to attack us, you'll have to face this," he shouted, his eyes blazing with the same intensity as the fire in his hand. The creature let out a hideous screech but didn't advance. The fire was making it hesitate. I grabbed another burning branch and stepped forward beside Rick, both of us holding the makeshift torches high as we advanced toward the edge of the woods. We had cornered it, but was this enough to end the nightmare? I am Conrad Dillard, a ranger in Maine's National Forest. My whole life has been tied to these dense forests and wilderness, having faced many dangers such as snowstorms and ferocious wildlife. But none of that compares to what I experienced on a terrifying night in 2005. That night, I came face to face with something I never thought could be real. It was early winter when snow had begun to cover the trails, and the Maine woods had turned colder and gloomier than ever. My colleague Dave and I were assigned to search for a group of hikers who had gone missing near Blackstone Falls, an area known for its mysterious stories and unexplained events. Dave was a seasoned ranger, and we both regarded searching for lost hikers as a routine part of the job. But as we entered the Blackstone Falls area, the atmosphere began to shift. An oppressive, unnatural chill surrounded us, as if the forest itself was alive and watching our every step. "Do you feel anything strange?" Dave asked as we ventured deeper into the woods. I nodded. Everything was eerily quiet. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees. Just absolute silence. The silence of death. Each of our footsteps crunched softly on the thin layer of snow, the sound stark and clear in the emptiness. We continued moving, cutting through the dense woods as daylight slowly faded with the setting sun. That's when I began to notice something odd. In the snow-covered ground, large, elongated footprints appeared. Prints unlike any animal I'd ever seen. The tracks stretched far ahead, leading us deeper into the darkness. "Do you see that?" Dave asked, his voice growing tense. I crouched down, touching the footprint in the snow. It was larger than any known animal tracks in the area, and the shape was bizarre, with long, sharp toes pressed deeply into the snow. "This isn't from a bear or a wolf," I said, my eyes fixed on the tracks in front of us. Dave remained silent, watching closely. We both realized something was wrong. The missing hikers might not have just gotten lost. Perhaps they had encountered something we had no knowledge of. We decided to follow the strange tracks, though an increasing sense of dread built up inside me. The footprints led us through dense forest, growing darker with every step, until finally they stopped at a place we had never seen on any map. It was a clearing, surrounded by barren, withered trees, a place abandoned centuries ago. In the middle of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof partially caved in and covered in moss. The moment we laid eyes on it, the air around us felt as though it had frozen. A chilling sense of dread filled me, as if we had stepped into a place that shouldn't exist. "I've never seen this cabin on any map," Dave said, his voice low and tense. "We need to be careful." I nodded. My instincts told me we shouldn't go any closer, but we couldn't leave without checking. The missing hikers might have sought shelter there, or worse, they might have been drawn there by something. We drew our guns and cautiously approached the cabin, each footstep crunching loudly on the thick snow. As we got closer, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of life around the cabin. No fire, no light, and not a single sound from within. Yet there was an eerie feeling that made it impossible for me to look away. It was as if something was hiding inside, waiting for us. "Is anyone here?" Dave called out, but there was no response. Only the echo of his own voice bounced back through the still air. We stepped onto the creaky wooden porch, and as soon as we touched the door, it swung open with a chilling screech. Inside, the cabin was pitch dark, but we could feel the presence of something. Something I couldn't explain. Dave flicked on his flashlight, and the beam revealed a horrifying scene. The cabin was empty, except for the tracks on the floor, footprints identical to the ones we had seen in the snow. But the most disturbing part was that the tracks didn't stop in one place. They led toward the back of the cabin, disappearing into the darkness of another door, as if the creature had dragged something inside. "I don't like this," Dave muttered, his voice filled with unease. I didn't respond, just quietly moved toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could sense the presence of something behind that door, something powerful and threatening. But I couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. Perhaps the missing hikers were inside. Maybe they were still alive. I reached out and grasped the door handle, and as I pushed it open, a cold gust of wind swept through, sending a chill down my spine. Inside, the flashlight beam illuminated a scene that took my breath away. On the floor lay something motionless, a human body, or at least what remained of it. The entire body had been torn apart, blood pooled beneath it, and the face was so disfigured it was unrecognizable. I stepped back, my hands shaking, while Dave stood frozen in shock. At that moment, a ghastly sound echoed from behind us. The rustling of heavy footsteps, the sound of deep, labored breathing. We turned around, and in the dim beam of the flashlight, I saw something I never wanted to encounter. A towering creature with pale, ghostly skin and fiery red eyes standing in the doorway. The creature wasn't human, nor was it any animal we had ever seen. It stood still, but its eyes were filled with hunger and savagery. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand as the creature emerged from the darkness. It stood there, motionless. The raw power radiating from its grotesque form seemed to pierce the air, hitting every cell in my body. The creature was at least 2 meters tall, with long legs and razor-sharp claws. Its skin was ghostly pale, almost translucent, with veins running beneath the surface. Its glowing red eyes were like hellfire, shining out from deep, hollow socket. It didn't move immediately, just stood there staring at us, as if it was assessing the prey before it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. Neither Dave nor I dared to breathe, frozen in place, waiting for what would happen next. Dave was the first to break the horrifying silence. "We have to get out of here now," whispered, his voice shaky but resolute. I nodded. My eyes remained fixed on the creature in front of us. It didn't move, but I could feel each second slipping away as it prepared to strike. An invisible terror gripped me. I knew that standing still would mean certain death. "Run!" Dave shouted, and he bolted toward the back door of the cabin, the one leading into the forest. I had no other choice and followed him, leaving the terrifying creature standing in the doorway. We crashed through the back door, flinging it open to reveal the pitch-black forest beyond. Both of us plunged into the night, the sound of our footsteps crunching through the snow echoing in the eerie silence. My heart pounded, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I knew I couldn't stop. That creature wouldn't give up easily. Behind us, I heard it. Horrific scraping sounds of claws against the wooden floor, and a guttural growl deep in the creature's throat. It was chasing us. Without needing to look back, I could feel its terrifying presence drawing closer. Darkness engulfed the forest, and only the faint beam from Dave's flashlight served as our guide. We ran through the barren pine trees, dodging broken branches and boulders, but the creature's raspy, menacing breaths echoed closer with every step. Each time I heard it, I knew the creature was gaining on us. "We need to slow it down," I shouted, though I wasn't sure what could possibly stop this thing. Dave didn't answer, only kept running ahead of me. His eyes were wild, but not entirely hopeless. "There's a stream nearby," he panted. "If we can get there, maybe the water will make it hesitate." We kept running, no time to think of any other plan. I wasn't sure if the stream would actually help, but it was the only hope we had. A few minutes later, the creature caught up to us. It lunged through the darkness, and suddenly I heard a blood-curdling scream from Dave ahead. I turned in panic, just in time to witness the horrifying scene. The creature's long, sharp claws had sunk deep into Dave's shoulder, dragging him down to the ground. He thrashed, trying to escape its grip, but the creature's strength was overwhelming. "No!" I screamed, rushing toward the creature with my gun in hand. In that moment, I forgot all my fear. I couldn't abandon Dave, couldn't let him become the next victim of this creature. I raised the gun, aimed directly at the creature, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the silence of the night, and the bullet flew straight into the creature. Strangely, it didn't injure it. Instead, the creature let out a terrifying roar, a sound so chilling it froze me in place. It turned its head, its fiery red eyes locking onto me as if it wanted to devour my soul right then and there. I stumbled back, my hands trembling so much I almost dropped the gun. Something unexpected happened. As my flashlight beam hit the creature's eyes, it suddenly stopped. It stood still, its red eyes blinking rapidly, as if the light was causing it pain. That's when I realized the creature was afraid of the light. "I've figured it out, the light," I shouted to Dave, who was still struggling to free himself from the creature's claws. "The light weakens it." Dave immediately understood and grabbed his flashlight, shining it directly into the creature's face. The creature roared in pain, as if the light was burning it from the inside. It staggered back, its claws slowly releasing Dave, then it stumbled away into the darkness of the forest. We didn't waste the opportunity. Both of us sprinted toward the nearby stream. Our heavy breaths mixed with the sound of rushing water as we crossed the stream. The creature stood on the opposite bank, growling in fury, but refusing to step into the light. Remained there, its fiery red eyes watching us until we vanished into the night. We had escaped, but I knew the creature wouldn't stop. Maine, with its pristine beauty and quiet wilderness, now held a terrifying secret. So if you ever go hiking in the woods, remember this story. Sometimes the things we fear most don't just exist in our minds. Sometimes they are very real and much closer than you think. And if you hear a sound you can't explain, it might be best to turn back the way you came. My name is Ezra McAllister, and this story happened to me in 2008. I work as a ranger at Cascade Falls, Washington. Quiet place with winding trails through thick forests and waterfalls that occasionally attract hikers or birdwatchers. I took this job because it allowed me to combine my love for nature, a steady paycheck, and honestly, because it kept me away from people. I'm not much of a social person, but the solitude was comforting. My daily tasks mostly involved trail maintenance, checking the campsites, and occasionally helping lost hikers. One morning, I was sitting in the ranger station, sipping on a cup of cold coffee and scanning the weather reports when a call came in over the radio. It was Barney Gallagher, another ranger working in the southern part of the park. He was grumbling about a group of teenagers who had set up camp in a restricted area near the falls. I grabbed my gear, put on my jacket, and headed out. The hike to the falls wasn't long, but it was steep. The trail was surrounded by towering pine trees, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. As I got closer, I could hear the distant roar of the waterfall. Barney met me at the trailhead, and we walked together to the campsite, chatting about everyday things like the weather, the latest football scores, and the never-ending issues, Barney's old truck. When we reached the campsite, it was clear the kids had already left, but they'd left behind a mess. A small tent had collapsed, and trash was scattered everywhere. Barney and I started cleaning up, grumbling about how kids these days didn't respect nature. Suddenly, I noticed a small notebook half buried under a pile of leaves. Picked it up and flipped through it. Most of the pages were blank, but a few had been written on in a child's scrawl, likely one of the teenagers. I stuffed it into my pocket, planning to turn it in later at the ranger station. That evening, after dinner, I sat on my porch with the sound of crickets in the background and started reading through the notebook. Most of the journal entries were typical teenage stuff: school, friends, and the usual frustrations. Toward the end, a few entries caught my attention. There's something watching us. One entry read, "We keep hearing noises at night, but we can't see anything. It's starting to scare me." Another entry mentioned seeing dark figures moving in the woods and feeling like they were being followed. A chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off, assuming it was just kids letting their imaginations run wild. Still, I decided to keep the notebook close, just in case. The next few days passed uneventfully. The park was quiet, and my patrols and maintenance tasks went smoothly. Then, one night, I was jolted awake by the sudden crackle of the radio. It was Barney again. But this time, he sounded genuinely frightened. "Ezra, you there?" The voice was shaky. "Yeah, I'm here. What's going on?" I answered, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. "There's something out here. I don't know what it is, but it's big and fast. Been following me." Frowned. Barney wasn't the type to get scared easily. "Where are you?" "Near the old logging road, past the second waterfall." "Can you come out here?" "I'm on my way," I said, grabbing my flashlight and rifle. I wasn't one to believe in the supernatural, but I also wasn't about to take any chances. The night was pitch black, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The trail was nearly invisible, even with the flashlight, and the sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the darkness. When I finally reached the logging road, I found Barney leaning against a tree, his face pale and his hands trembling. "What happened?" I asked, scanning the area with my flashlight. "I don't know, man. I heard something crashing through the woods, and when I turned around, I saw it. It was something I've never seen before. Tall, hunched, with glowing eyes. It moved so fast, too fast." "Did it attack you?" "No, but it made me feel like it was toying with me. It would disappear and then show up closer. I thought I was losing my mind." I nodded, gripping my rifle tightly. "Let's head back to the station." We began making our way back, moving quickly but carefully. I kept my eyes wide open and listened closely, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. When we finally reached the station, Barney collapsed into a chair, still trembling. "Calm down, Barney. We'll figure this out," I said, handing him a cup of coffee. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Barney had said and the notes in the journal. There was something out there, something that didn't belong. The next day, I decided to conduct a thorough patrol of the area where Barney had encountered. I wanted to see if there were any signs of what he had described. The old logging road was overgrown with weeds, almost unrecognizable as a trail. I moved slowly, scanning the ground for any clues. After about an hour, I found something. It was a footprint, but unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was large, much larger than any human foot, and the toes were elongated, almost claw-like. I snapped a picture with my phone and continued further. Soon, I found more tracks leading deeper into the woods. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest grew denser, the trees seeming to close in around me. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Then I saw it. First, it was just a shadow moving between the trees, but as I got closer, I could make out its shape. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with long arms and a hunched posture. Its eyes glowed faintly yellow, and it moved with an eerie grace. I froze, gripping my rifle tightly. The creature stopped and turned its head toward me. We stared at each other for a moment, and then, with a speed that took my breath away, vanished into the forest. I stood there for a while, trying to process what I had just seen. Then I turned back and made my way to the station, my mind racing. I needed to figure out what this thing was and how to deal with it. Back at the station, I started researching. I dug through old records, folklore, and anything related to creatures in the woods. One story kept coming up, the legend of the wendigo. According to the tale, the wendigo was a spirit that possessed humans, turning them into terrifying cannibals. But this creature didn't fit the description of a wendigo. It was something else, something I couldn't name. In the following days, more reports began to surface. Hikers went missing, and campers reported hearing strange noises and seeing eerie figures. The park began to feel different. There was an air of tension and unease. Barney and I ramped up our patrols, but it always felt like we were one step behind. Then one night, everything came to a head. I was on patrol, checking the trails near the second waterfall, and I heard a scream. It was a chilling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I ran toward the noise, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I found her near the edge of the waterfall. A young woman, barely conscious, clothes torn and soaked in blood. I knelt beside her, checking her injuries. She had deep gashes on her chest and arms, and her breathing was labored. "Help me, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hang in there, I'm here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I grabbed my radio and called for backup, but there was no response. Only silence filled the radio waves, and panic began to creep in. I knew I had to handle this on my own. I lifted her gently, trying to keep her calm. We started making our way back to the station, but every step felt like it stretched into eternity. The forest was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes, and the creature appeared. It stood there, staring at us, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. I raised my rifle, but I knew it was futile. This thing was faster than anything I'd ever encountered. "Get back," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The creature tilted its head, as if curious, and then it charged. I fired, but the shot missed. Knocked me to the ground, its claws raking across my chest. Pain exploded in my side, but I fought back, kicking and punching with everything I had. Then, suddenly, it stopped. It stared at me, its eyes narrowing, and then it turned and vanished into the forest. I lay there, gasping for breath. Girl still unconscious beside me. I knew we couldn't stay there. With every bit of strength left in me, I lifted her again and stumbled back to the station. Barney was waiting for us, his face pale. "What happened?" he asked, helping me bring the girl inside. "We need to get her to a hospital," I said, ignoring his question. "And we need to call the police. There's something out there, and it's not going to stop." Following days were a blur. The girl, who I later learned was named Carla, was taken to the hospital, and the park was temporarily closed. The police launched an investigation, but they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of the creature. It was as if it had never existed. Barney and I were questioned repeatedly, but our story seemed too unbelievable. The official report concluded it was a bear attack, but I knew better. I had seen it, and I knew it was still out there. I decided to quit my job as a ranger after that. The memories were too heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching me, waiting for its next move. I moved to the city, where the noise and crowds were a welcome distraction. Sometimes at night, I still hear the sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant roar of the waterfall, and the memory of those glowing eyes watching from the darkness. I don't know what it is or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure. It's still out there, waiting. And that's my story. Believe it or not, that's up to you. But if you ever go hiking in Cascade Falls, keep your eyes wide open and stay alert. You never know what might be lurking in the darkness. I don't know what it is or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure. It's still out there, waiting, and that's my story. Believe it or not, that's up to you. But if you ever go hiking in Cascade Falls, keep your eyes wide open and stay alert. You never know what might be lurking in the darkness. I stood frozen, heart pounding, as it just stood there staring at me, unmoving. I raised my flashlight and shone it directly at the creature. It hissed and retreated into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned and ran down the trail as fast as I could. I called Earl on the radio, panting and terrified. "Earl, there's something out here. It's not human." "What are you talking about, Braden?" "I don't know, some kind of creature. It just stood there, watching me." "Get back here right away," Earl said. "We'll figure this out." I didn't need to be told twice. I raced down the trail, my flashlight swinging wildly. Didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, where Earl was waiting. I tried to explain what I had seen, but it sounded crazy, even to me. Earl listened, his face serious. "All right," said finally. "We'll go back there at first light, see if we can find Dylan, and figure out what's going on." That night was the longest of my life. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept thinking about the woman's words. Don't let it catch me. I wondered if Dylan had seen the same thing, if he was still out there, hiding from. The next morning, Earl and I set out at dawn. We both carried weapons, just in case. As we climbed the trail, the forest was eerily silent. We found Dylan's jacket and backpack, but no sign of him. When we reached the spot where I had seen the creature, we discovered new tracks. They were large and resembled human footprints. The toes were elongated. Earl crouched down to examine them. "These aren't bear tracks," he said, "but they're not human either." We followed the tracks further up the trail, and they led us to a cave, partially hidden by a thicket of bushes. Entrance was dark and gave off a chilling vibe. "You sure about this?" Earl asked, glancing at me. "I'm not," I admitted, "but we have to find Dylan." We stepped into the cave, the light from our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was cold and damp, the walls slick with moisture. The deeper we went, the stronger the feeling of being watched returned. We found more signs of a struggle. Broken branches, torn pieces of clothing, and what looked like smears of blood. My stomach churned as we pressed on. Suddenly we heard a noise ahead, a rustling sound, followed by a deep, ghastly breathing. We raised our flashlights and saw the creature crouched over something. It was Dylan. He was lying on the ground, motionless. The creature looked up at us, its eyes reflecting the light. "Get away from him," Earl shouted, raising his gun. Creature hissed and lunged at us. Earl pulled the trigger, the gunshot echoing through the cave. Creature screeched and retreated into the darkness. We rushed to Dylan. He was still alive, but barely. We lifted him up and started carrying him out of the cave. As we did, we could hear the creature moving in the shadows, stalking us. We moved as quickly as we could, the flashlight beams flickering across the cave walls. The sound of the creature grew louder, its breathing heavier, getting closer. Just as we reached the cave's exit, it lunged at us. Earl fired again, hitting it square in the chest. The creature howled and fell back, giving us just enough time to escape. We made it back to the ranger station, where we called for help. Dylan was taken to the hospital, and we gave our statements to the police. They searched the cave, but found no trace of the creature. In the weeks that followed, it couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching us. Dylan recovered, but he was never the same. He refused to talk about what happened and moved away as soon as he could. Earl and I continued our jobs, but we never returned to that part of the park. The memory of that night stayed with us, a reminder that there are things in this world we don't understand. I don't know what that creature was or where it came from. Maybe some kind of forest spirit, or something ancient and darker. We started calling it the Pale Stalker. We rarely spoke of it. Life moved on. I couldn't forget. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear it outside my window. The rustle of leaves, faint hiss carried on the wind. I don't know if it's real or just my imagination, but it keeps me awake, wondering if it will ever return. The park is quieter now, fewer people visit, and those who do don't venture far from the main trails. We don't advertise the Green River Trail anymore. It's still there, winding through the trees, up the hills, to the lake where the pale stalker waits. My name is Roy Delmar, a seasoned ranger at the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. This place is famous for its mysterious beauty, with deep black waters and thick trees scattered among the interwoven channels. But to me, Okefenokee is more than just an ordinary nature reserve. Beneath the murky swamps lie things no one dares to speak of. And my story is proof of the horrors I've faced in this place. One evening in early summer of 2001, as darkness began to fall over the skeletal trees, I received a call from the station. A group of tourists had lost contact in the swamp, and my task was to find them. It wasn't uncommon for tourists to get lost in Okefenokee, especially when the sun sets and night envelops the swamp, where light struggles to penetrate the dense canopy. I had dealt with similar situations many times, but tonight something felt different. The air was unusually cold, not like the sweltering heat typical of summer. The wind whispered through the swaying branches, creating eerie sounds. It felt as though an invisible presence was watching me from afar, making every step I took feel heavier. Jerry, fellow ranger, and I boarded a small boat to begin the search. The black water beneath us was like a hazy mirror, reflecting the thick trees and the faint glow of the moon. Everything was drowned in an eerie silence. No frogs croaking, no buzzing insects like usual. The swamp was pitch dark and so quiet that even the smallest sound could send shivers down your spine. "Do you feel something wrong?" Jerry asked, his voice low, filled with concern. I didn't answer immediately, only glancing around. There was something off, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. "Keep looking," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. We paddled further into the swamp, the spotlight from the boat illuminating moss-covered tree trunks and the still water. Suddenly, Jerry stopped. "Roy, look," he whispered, pointing ahead. I followed his gaze and my heart seemed to stop. Before us was a bizarre sight. A small boat overturned, floating on the black water. Around the boat were strange marks in the mud, large footprints unlike any creature I had ever seen. They were enormous, with a bizarre shape like the claws of some beast, but longer and more slender, and the tracks extended into the deep swamp. Jerry and I paddled closer to the boat, the light shining on the old boat's hull and the black, muddy sludge. There was no sign of the visitors, but the footprints sent a shiver down my spine. What on earth happened here? Jerry whispered, his eyes fixed on the mud marks. I didn't know, but I was sure those footprints didn't belong to any swamp creatures we had encountered. As we were about to turn the boat back, a strange sound came from deep within the swamp. Faint screech, like metal rubbing together, but as if it were coming from a living creature. Jerry and I froze. The screech echoed through the space, lingering and cold, like a warning from something not of this world. "Do you hear that?" I asked quietly, even though I already knew the answer. Jerry nodded, his eyes wide with visible fear on his face. "We shouldn't stay here long," he said softly, trying to stay calm. I agreed, but before I could turn the boat around, a cold draft brushed past my back. It felt like something very close, standing right behind us. We hurriedly paddled, but as I glanced back over my shoulder, what I saw made the blood in my veins freeze. In the darkness and thick foliage, I saw a massive shape. Creature standing silently, watching us. It was at least 3 meters tall, with glowing eyes in the dark, and a wide mouth with sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. I breathed heavily, unable to speak. The creature remained still, not moving, but its presence left me paralyzed. It didn't resemble any earthly creature, not an alligator, not a bear, and definitely not human. "Roy?" Jerry called, his voice trembling. "Paddle, quickly." I screamed, my voice breaking with fear. Jerry and I paddled with all our might, but the creature followed us, not fast but with certainty. Each step it took made strange sounds, the muddy sludge crunching under the weight of its massive body. We paddled faster, the sound of the water splashing against the boat echoing in the eerie silence of the space. But the creature stayed close, its shadow growing larger, gradually enveloping the entire surrounding area. I knew that if we didn't escape this area quickly, it would catch up and finish us off. My name is Roy Delmar, and this story happened to me not long ago. I work as a ranger in the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia. I know what you're thinking. What trouble could a ranger run into in a swamp? Let me tell you, there's more out there than just alligators and snakes. I've been a ranger for over 15 years, spending most of my time outdoors and loving every minute of it. The swamp is like a second home to me. There's something peaceful about the murky water and the ever-extending cypress tree. It can be lonely at times, but I enjoy the quiet. It gives me time to reflect. One afternoon, I was patrolling as usual. The sun was high and the heat was intense. I navigated my airboat through the channels, checking for signs of illegal activity or distressed wildlife. The swamp seemed strangely quiet that day, as if it were holding its breath. I moved toward a less frequented part of the swamp, an area we call the Dead Stretch. It's just a local legend. Supposedly, a trapper disappeared there many years ago, and people say his spirit still roams the area. I'm not much for ghost stories, but I've learned to respect the land and its tales. As I approached the Dead Stretch, I noticed something was off. There were signs of movement, broken branches, and disturbed mud, as if someone or something had recently passed through. I stopped the boat and decided to investigate on foot. I gathered my gear, including my rifle, just in case. You never know what might happen out there. I waded through the muck, the air thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water. I could hear birds in the distance and occasionally the splash of alligators. But there was something else, a faint rustling sound that seemed out of place. I followed the sound, advancing cautiously, my senses on edge. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was a makeshift campsite. There were signs that someone had recently stayed there, discarded food wrappers, a torn sleeping bag, and an old lantern. My instincts told me something was wrong. This wasn't just a lost camper. I called out, but there was no response. I moved closer, gun at the ready. That was when I noticed a small notebook lying on the ground. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Most of it was illegible, but there were drawings, intricate images of distorted human figures. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a low and eerie growl that sent chills down my spine. I spun around, but saw nothing. The swamp seemed to close in around me, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. I decided it was time to leave and report what I had found. As I returned to the boat, I felt as if someone was watching me. Every rustle of leaves, every splash of water made my nerves tense. Finally, I reached the boat and started the engine, eager to get away from that frightening campsite. That night, couldn't settle. I kept thinking about the drawings and the strange sounds I had heard. I decided to investigate further, digging into local legends and stories. What I discovered was terrifying. There were tales of a creature known as the Swamp Man, a humanoid figure said to lurk in the depths of Okefenokee, preying on the unwary. I barely slept that night. The next day, I returned to the ranger station and reported my findings to my supervisor, Matt. He was the type who didn't believe in things he couldn't see with his own eyes, but even he seemed uneasy about the whole situation. "Roy, you're not just scaring yourself with shadows, are you?" Matt asked, trying to lighten the mood. "I wish that were the case," I shook my head in response. "There's something out there, Matt. I can feel it." He sighed and agreed to send a few rangers to investigate further. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Something told me I needed to return to find out what was really going on. A few days later, I geared up and returned to the Dead Stretch, this time with my friend Jerry. Jerry had been a ranger nearly as long as I had, and he had seen many strange things. He didn't hesitate to come with me, though I could see he was still skeptical. We arrived at the campsite and found it exactly as I had left it. Jerry examined the area while I stood guard, rifle at the ready. As the sun began to set, the swamp took on a strange, almost frightening quality. The sounds of nocturnal creatures seemed amplified and the air was thick with tension. "Roy, come here," Jerry called, his voice tense. I hurried over to where he was standing. He had found a trapdoor hidden under a layer of weeds. We pried it open, revealing a narrow tunnel leading into darkness. We exchanged glances, both knowing what we had to do. We descended into the tunnel, and our flashlights cutting through the dark. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in strange markings, similar to what I had seen in the notebook. We moved slowly, each step echoing in the tight space. Then we heard it, a soft rustling sound, as if something was moving just ahead of us. We pressed on, our hearts pounding in our chests. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, and that's when we saw it. The creature was hunched over, its back turned to us. It looked human, but its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. It slowly turned around, revealing eyes that glinted in the dim light. "Jerry, what the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," he replied, gripping his rifle tightly. We began to back away, but the creature moved faster than I could have imagined. It lunged at Jerry, its claws slashing across his chest. He screamed and fired his gun, the shot echoing loudly in the confined space. The creature screeched in terror and retreated into the darkness. I pulled Jerry to his feet and helped him out of the tunnel, creature's cries still echoing behind us. We didn't stop until we were back at the boat. Jerry was bleeding heavily, and I tried to patch him up as we sped back to the station. We called for help, and an ambulance was waiting at the dock. Jerry was taken to the hospital, and I had to explain what had happened. Matt listened, his face pale and serious. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Jerry survived, but he was never the same again. He resigned from the Forest Service and moved away, trying to forget what had happened. As for me, couldn't let it go. I continued to search for answers. The more I learned, the more questions I had. I never saw that creature again, but its presence still haunts me. The swamp is not just a beautiful and peaceful place. It is one filled with secrets and dangers. I continued my work, but I remained vigilant, always on the lookout for signs of the unknown. People still go missing in Okefenokee, and the legend of the swamp man endures. Some say it's just a tale to scare tourists, but I know better. There's something out there, something that defies explanation. I've learned to live with the fear, accepting that there are things beyond our understanding. But every time I patrol the swamp, I keep my rifle close and my senses sharp. Because deep in Okefenokee, you never know what might be watching you. That's my story. It's not one I like to tell often, but it's the truth. The swamp holds many secrets, and some secrets are best left undisturbed. But if you ever find yourself in Okefenokee, remember that there's more out there than meets the eye. And sometimes the darkness holds more than just shadows.